what social media also does, and there's a lot of research that's coming out, is social media is designed to keep the user engaged and to be engaged and interacting with the screen for as long as possible. And what has been talked about is there are ways to interact with social media that will likely lead to not feeling great versus ways that will.
Okay, welcome back to the Become Your Own Therapist podcast, the podcast where I try to put myself out of a job as a clinical psychologist. Today, I'm delighted to have Dr. Paula Durlofsky with me. She has her PhD and is a licensed psychologist with a private practice in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. As a practicing therapist for over 18 years and recent winner of Best Therapist in 2017's Best of the Mainline Awards, Durlofsky helps individuals, couples, and families to reach their full potential for leading lives with passion and purpose. Durlofsky is a member of the American Psychological Association's Device Management and Digital Intelligence Committee, whose goal is to support healthy relationships with technology through intelligent engagement and modeling positive digital citizenship. She is also affiliated with Bryn Mawr Hospital, Lankenau Medical Center, and the Psychoanalytic Center of Philadelphia. Over the course of her career, she has taught as an adjunct professor and as an instructor to medical residents, specializing in internal medicine and psychiatry. She has even been immortalized as the inspiration for the character Dr. Paula Agard on the popular USA Network show Suits. Her expert opinions, based on over 2 decades of clinical experience and training, have been featured in Mary Claire, Teen Vogue, APA's Monotone Psychology, Exceptional Parenting Magazine, Mainline Health, Psych Central, and Mainline Today, as well as the Pennsylvania Conference for Women and on ABC 10 KX TV. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, great. So I invited you because I came across your book, Logged In and Stressed Out, which I think is extremely relevant as the number of, social media users and mobile phone possessors increases, as the years go by. So I think it's relevant, but I was wondering what inspired you to get involved in this particular niche of psychology, the link between mental health and social media.
Well, what had motivated me to write about social media and mental health was I began to see in my practice more and more people coming in talking about how their social media use and screen time use was affecting their mental health, their relationships, their ability to focus. It was also disrupting their sleep cycles, and it just became more and more of an awareness for me as well as for the people that I was working with, just how much social media was affecting them this broadly. So I began to really make a point of when I would meet with new people and begin to start therapy with them, that would be one of the questions that I would ask them in their first session is, tell me about your social media use.
That's a very interesting question. I know a lot of therapists ask about how your sleep is, your diet, exercise, sort of. But it feels like, social media use and phone use should be one of those foundational questions.
Yeah, I agree. And we also, of course, ask about substance use and, other types of behaviors that we already know will negatively affect our mood, our self-worth, our ability to function. And you're exactly right. And now starting to ask about social media because we're most recently becoming so aware of its impact. More and more, the research is backing up what we all thought and had a hunch about. And most recently, of course, with Instagram and the whistleblower who was able to expose research that clearly showed that Instagram use specifically affects too negatively young women and young girls' perceptions of body image and self-worth.
Yeah, I'd love to get into that and the book as well. And I'm just wondering, what were those initial things that you started seeing in your practice that were quite common? What were those common negative effects you were noticing?
People were telling me that they would spend hours and hours and hours of their time attached to their screens, scrolling through social media to the point where they weren't able to meet their responsibilities for work. Now, of course, this is the extreme. This was a handful of people, but still important nonetheless. And some, not many, but would also talk about kind of a binging also with the online gaming. And really, spending a few days actually involved in gaming. And other people able to identify it obviously as a way to avoid and to escape their responsibilities or a distraction, of course, about feelings that are very painful for them and us to bear or to think about and reflect on. So, and the other thing that they were able to identify and talk about was just how hard it was to stop. That once the engagement started with screens, social media, gaming, that it was really hard to pull back and stop. And of course, then the cycle begins like any other addictive or maladaptive behavior. Then it becomes not just the engagement of social media, but my gosh, then the feelings of guilt or despair that follow. There's also people were able to discuss, and this is something that the research has shown, and there's been a lot of articles written about, is that feelings of envy and despair would come about more so with scrolling through social media. And that are universal feelings, are human feelings. We all have feelings of envy. We all have feelings of despair. We all have feelings of comparison, comparing ourselves to someone else. And they're human feelings, and they're important feelings to pay attention to because they help us understand who we are as an individual, where we fit into to the world, to our communities, in our societies. They help these feelings kind of guide us and put us on a path as to what we can be and want to be in our society and how we can contribute. And those that have come before us are role models. And so having feelings of envy or comparison in context and in perspective is very healthy. It points us in a direction. But social media can make these feelings go from 0 to 100 in a second. And we don't have time then to kind of stop it. It just becomes something very self-destructive, and people often will turn it against themselves and be dealing with a cycle of judgment and guilt and harsh critical talk. And that's very hard to work one's way out of. We often get stuck there, and that's what a lot of people in treatment are looking to also change.
Yeah, sure. a lot there, but I'm hearing that it's not just negative in is sort of one domain, but there are these addictive elements. It creates certain ways of thinking about ourselves and judging ourselves, brings out certain emotions like envy and the comparison, putting ourselves down, um, avoiding life, actual life, real emotions that you're dealing with. So yeah, I'm hearing that this is very multidimensional.
It is. It's very, very complex because I believe at the core of social media, too, is that it taps into our humanness, our instinctual drives to connect and to interact with other human beings. And that, of course, is a very healthy drive. That's a good drive. What social media also does, and there's a lot of research that's coming out, is social media is designed to keep the user engaged and to be engaged and interacting with the screen for as long as possible. And what has been talked about is there are ways to interact with social media that will likely lead to not feeling great versus ways that could lead to a positive outcome. So for instance, just passively scrolling through social media without interacting, that the research has shown that typically makes someone feel worse than they had prior to logging on, that type of interaction is going to create a lot of envy, feelings of compare and despair versus interactive engagement with sending messages to a friend or interacting and having some sort of virtual conversation, kind of like in our real life, that socializing with others makes us feel good because we need that's we're built to do. So doing that online is also going to make someone feel better, not worse.
Okay.
So it's something to think about when you're using social media. So to bring about a degree of intention, even before you log on.
I'd love to get into the specifics of how you do that. But before I go there, I just want to ask about the passive element. Why do you think passively scrolling doesn't just lead to some sort of neutral scrolling state, but rather hooks us into a negative emotional space?
Well, that's a really good question. Why does that happen? Why is it that when we passively scroll, we are more likely to go to that darker place? And I think that what could be one of the factors that could create that is that social media is very much a place for people to showcase their best moments. And it's also a one-dimensional, sphere. It's pictures, it's a little blurb. And, usually people are showing moments of vacations or very special achievements, the highlights. And that's not life. Life is not just the highlights. Life involves, the hard times and the difficult times, and bad things happen in life to all of us. But that's not typically what people are posting about. So when we're constantly seeing a barrage of these wonderful moments, that could be difficult. And what can happen is, as I said, that we're not often aware of when we kind of cross that line. Like sometimes it's a little too late and we get stuck So something I think is really important and that I talk about in my book is to be able to identify triggers. And a way in which to do that is to simply really kind of keep a journal of how you're feeling before you're logging on, how you're feeling after, during, and after, and to see, if there are patterns. And of course, the idea is how can I get control and become and be more mindful of my social media use. And the way for us to get at it is to really be able to observe ourselves when we're doing social media and or engaged in it. And that's going to require stepping back from it as well. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. That's it. That seems very useful just to get your eyes on what's going on, because a lot of this can be so habitual, can become so automatic.
And which is understandable. That's human. We're humans. And it's very much a human platform. We're connecting, we're looking at others, we're vicariously experiencing things. It's what we do in real life too.
Yeah.
But there's a big difference.
So for the people listening in who are wondering, oh shucks, might I actually be, might something be a bit negative about my routine and my relationship to social media or any other sort of digital platform? What are some things to look out for? Some sort of red flags or some slippery slopes?
Well, I think that really being very mindful of how you feel before, during, and after. And being very aware and keeping track of that. And the other thing is to even dig a little deeper and try to connect. Well, are there certain people, are there certain accounts that when I look at them or after, visiting them, that I feel worse. And I think about these parts of either myself or my life that I begin to really judge myself in this very harsh way. And I become more and more stuck in, a problem or a situation where I begin to feel more and more helpless. And that's, I think, something to be very aware of, is that the reality that social media, that the dimension is one dimension. So when somebody posts, you're getting this snapshot in time. And as I was just saying, life is not a snapshot. It's complex, it's layered, it's deep, as are our feelings and our emotions. And we can often, I think, walk away from social media or interpret somebody's post in a very one-dimensional landscape. So it's important to also begin to maybe assess social media posts in a more three-dimensional or deeper way. And one thing is to think about, okay, when you see a post that you kind of respond, I'm feeling a little envious, to kind of take a moment and think about, well, what you're feeling envious about, but also to think about, well, if you know this person, to think about their life before the post, and were there other times in their life that, you remember, wait a second, you know what? I know this person's life is made up of X, Y, and Z, and this is just one moment in a person's time or life.
Yeah, lots of useful nuggets there. Being aware of how you're feeling before, during, and after. That's something I haven't, thought about it. I think I'll be more aware of that. But it's so simple, yet it's so easily missed. Just to think about, how am I feeling after engaging in this, or before, or during. Yeah.
And that to think about doing that as that's a form of self-care. And there's a lot of talk now, which I'm so happy about self-care and how important it is to incorporate that into one's life. And stepping away from social media is a form of self-care, but we need to know why. And something, when I talk about, well, how are you feeling before social media and why I feel that is so important, is that if you can acknowledge you're maybe not in a great place, maybe if somebody had a conflict with a loved one, or there's a situation that's difficult at work or school, that logging on wouldn't perhaps be the best decision at that time. And knowing to step away from the screen and put it down is, self-care, and a very valuable skill for one to gain control of their screen time and social media use.
Mm-hmm. If social media use can leave us feeling quite negative afterwards, what is the drive to use it? What's the reward? Because when I think of addictive behaviors, I think of some sort of like reward, some sort of drive, our like motivational system being activated. What do you think causes that?
Well, I think it's just simply that we are, as humans, we are wired to connect and socialize and be with other people, and that, quite honestly, our lives depend on other people and relationships, and the interdependency and independency of our relationships. So it really, really taps into that very primal human instinct and need. So I think that is very, fundamental to social media. And the other thing is when we talk about our relationships and our primal need to connect, we also develop very early on a style with which we attach to other people. And, attachment, and a lot of research has been written about how that early attachment style that is formed early in our lives, the secure attachment, the anxious attachment, and the avoidant attachment style. The secure, of course, being the least problematic, and what I write about in my book is going to be reflected in our social media use too. So it's something to think about. That, if you're having a lot of difficulty in your relationships or with your relationships offline, you may also, or you're likely going to have, this is going to carry over to online.
Yeah, I think that's, what came to mind is just this drive to connect that you started speaking about. This drive to connect and to be with others, and how survival depends on it. But then also how our relationships can get into trouble by the very same, drive leading us to this platform.
And then our connections, the way we connect, offline, online. And it becomes like, I feel like, well, not only is one struggling with their offline relationships, then one is also struggling with their online. And it's just becomes so much more problematic and difficult. And I think about this with kids and young adults that have really developed and grown during the digital age, and how my concern is that their identities and ability to relate and to connect offline isn't fully developed. And that some really necessary steps have been missed. And there's also some, parents that are younger that, they've maybe have grown up in the digital age as well. And so there are just there are some maybe more solid ways of connecting and interacting in their development that wasn't addressed or developed or cultivated. And that will impact future generations, right?
Yeah, tell me a bit more about that. I know you write about it in the book, relationships and connection, and the impact social media is having on that. Are there any positives, and what are the negatives?
Well, something that I think about and that I have been thinking about since I wrote the book, because since I've written the book and the book has been published, a lot has happened too. And so I've been learning and thinking about the impact of social media in ways that I hadn't considered or was not brought to my attention when I wrote the book. And something that I think more and more about is, of course, social media's reach beyond just on our world, beyond the person, individual, but going back to, individuals and kids and adolescents, and, what does it mean for future generations, that a part of being a quote unquote healthy person, individual, is being able to also regulate our emotions and understanding what emotions are and how they can guide us and help us also through life with relationships and, lots of other things. So a lot of, we know as psychologists and worldwide that for adolescents, there is a mental health crisis. And for other individuals, that the rate of suicide has increased. The ways in which people communicate, especially, young people on social media, talking about feelings, it's a scary place. So in regards to that, I've been really thinking about the role of the parent and, adults really being more thoughtful about modeling social media use, and maybe even bringing the idea of how to use social media skillfully into the school system. And really talking about, okay, social media literacy. I'm sorry. I'm having trouble with my words right now. But
it's an ironic word to have trouble with.
Yes. But that, thinking about that being a part of the curriculum. Somehow we need to teach this.
So, if I appointed you Minister of Education, Global Education, what sort of things would you think about teaching the children in terms of using social media skillfully? It's a
The
big
re-
one.
Well, I think that this could be a wonderful moment, something that your podcast does, and how it's so wonderful that you can contribute to the world in this way and to people's lives, is to talk about psychology and our development and how important it is to our, knowing about ourselves helps us to feel better, helps us to develop and puts us in a place where we can be healthier. So something that I think is so important, and I think what social media underscores, is the need for us as a civilization to have a greater understanding of our psychology, of what it is to be human, of our instincts, what our natural instinctual aggression instinct and love instinct and need to belong. And I think that this relates, and there's a lot of readings and scholars that talk about this related to war and how, psychologically, how we can use these theories to help, create a more peaceful world. So I think that introducing this very early on in, one's academic life could really be very helpful for future generations. And obviously being able to connect social media to this, because like I said at the beginning of this podcast, social media is a reflection of what it is to be human. It's our humanness, our basic need to connect. But it can get very twisted when it's only virtual connections or screen time connections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating. That's a very fascinating answer. And it's something that cropped up into my head while you were speaking, is that a lot of the discussion is around the consumption end, what happens at the consumption end of social media. And I was just wondering at the production end, people creating content, because there's, there are things to be aware of while scrolling and while consuming content, but we are the same people who are putting out content onto the platforms.
Right. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that, on the people who are creating content, and what, possibilities are there for us to, I don't know, have a positive impact in this space?
So the people that are, what do you mean? The people that are creating the content?
Yes. Yeah. Like,
Yeah.
should we be more, for example, should we be more vulnerable in terms of our, the presenting the parts of ourselves that is not just the highlight, for example? Because I see this problem as being able to be addressed on the creation end as well, the people who are choosing only to put up highlights, or just as an example.
Right. Well, I think that something that social media requires us, and the skill that is learned, or I think could be helpful to be learned early on, is how to interpret a social media post. So, we're only seeing this image and maybe with a, line or two. So the context can sometimes be, well, what is this person saying? And why is this person posting this now? What could this mean? How does it make me feel? So I think really being able to sometimes put yourself in the person's place that is posting and thinking about what it is that they're trying to communicate. And there are, I think, some very clear, when you're talking about other, accounts or social media platforms that, can be very positive, that really create a lot of hope and inspiration. And so, those accounts are, I think, not as complicated as the other accounts or social media platforms that, are likely to create more envy or confusion or negativity. I think those are more the accounts or the social media platforms that people will struggle with more than those that are clear.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
It does. And I want to follow up on that. Would you mind just elaborating on what platforms you think might lend themselves a bit to the more destructive elements versus others?
I don't know the particular platforms, but I think that we all struggle, just as humans, that, dealing with emotions that are difficult, dealing with sadness, with loss, with grief, with anger, with disappointment. Those are really hard feelings and hard states. We all feel so good when we're happy, and maybe, it's not as complicated or as difficult. So we know that offline. So I think I would assume that it would be the same online. But I think something that's really important that I'm thinking about is that, being happy or creating happiness in one's life is also a skill that we learn, that we acquire. And we can think about that with our on-screen life too, that, really being thoughtful about checking in with the accounts that we know make us feel good, that are inspirational, that, we skillfully choose to go to those accounts, and maybe even to incorporate that in a ritual, in a morning, for instance, going to an inspirational account when you wake up and reading it could be really helpful to kind of set the tone for the day. And knowing that an account that's maybe more about, physical appearance, or more about these highlights, which could create some negative feelings, to skillfully not visit those sites if, in the morning, or kind of put them in a different place. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it sounds like that kind of thinking would really allow you to create an opportunity out of a situation that could be sticky, because once you know the kinds of effects that specific content or pages have on you, suddenly you've got levers to pull if you use it.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So again, it's another form of self-protection, digital self-protection, that, knowing that certain sites, and that's a human feeling, could pull that lever.
Yeah.
To not go there, to step away from them, to stay away even. Until, and that's also a wonderful way for somebody to say, what, this is something too that I need to examine offline first. To really take the time to offline cultivate a deeper understanding of what those levers are, and where they come from.
Yeah, 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 great. And suddenly something that could have worked in the background against you becomes something that can actually bring self-awareness. Yeah, really seeing the opportunity here to cultivate the self-awareness.
Offline, right?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Which means that you're more in control with your online. And I think I want to say that I also have been thinking about, particularly with kids too, or anyone, is to really have a solid sense of yourself and your, identity offline before. Because if we're struggling with who we are or how we feel about ourselves, am I a good person? Am I a bad person? Using information virtually to validate that or to, figure that out is not going to end well. And it's not going to be helpful. So,
Yeah,
that'll
great.
be a constant yo, and that's not a good place to be. That's a really hard place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the phrase you use, that digital self-protection. And I think maybe it'll be a useful phrase to end on, just to check, if for all those listening, and maybe for those who haven't had the opportunity to read your book, how would you summarize maybe just some key points of digital self-protection? What would you want the listener to know?
I think it's really important for people to not see stepping away from social media, not engaging for a little bit of time, not responding to someone that you maybe need more time to think about what to say or do, is not a failure. That it is a form of self-love, and that it's important. That it is important. And emotions and feelings are human, and they are difficult. And that they take experience and talking through with another person with whom you trust, offline, is the goal. And then you'll be able to, because no one can really do it online. It really does need to be offline.
Yeah, Dr. Durlofsky, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and the useful information. I appreciate you being here. And
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it very much.
of course. And I just wanted to check in before you leave, where the viewers can learn about a bit more about you and the work you do.
They can reach me on, I guess, at my website, drpauladurlofsky.com.
Okay.
And that has all of my other connections, like Facebook or Instagram.